essentially what I will be engaged in is looking at the concept of international trade, the direction that the elements of trade follow, some of the impacting factors, and what we can do as we look forward to developing the trading or participation in the international trade system from a country perspective. Essentially, the concept goes beyond pure goods and services crossing the borders. But the key point to make is that international trade is a significant contributor to GDP, and it touches on many facets of development. It's no longer adequate to talk about trade just in the context of trade and services. It's a complete problem. So you find that other dimensions include the balance of payments issues. It touches on competition policy, government procurement, dispute settlement, electronic commerce, and pictorially we can look at things like climate change, technology, even gender issues, labor, ICT. So, in short, the international trade problem is multifaceted. Goods and services are just one component of the discourse. In the core of the discussion, I want to touch on three key sets of factors which impinge on international trade in a mutual, in a direction which one impacts the other, and the impact is also reversed. And as you can see from the pictorial presentation, they are not mutually exclusive. In terms of world trade, in the area of goods, we can see that the growth of the world trade in goods has been increasing over the years. The numbers are less important, but the concept is that the trade has been growing in goods. And in services, it has also been growing. And the key point is that over the years, the policy direction of countries in terms of liberalization, both in goods and services, are really intended to increase the overall rate at which goods and services cross the border. The distribution becomes an issue in terms of how those increases are shared among the various countries. This pictorial gives an indication of some of the countries that are involved in the trade in terms of groups, because trade blocs are a reality in the trade environment, and there are a number of countries that benefit from the trade significantly and others who struggle to benefit. So I've identified a number of the country groupings that over the 1% threshold. For those of you who may have been following the EPA when CARIFORUM did complete it, you would realize that one of the provisions inside here spoke about an MFN clause, which if CARIFORUM countries engage another developed country or group of countries, and the threshold used was really 1% in the case of individual countries and 1.5% in the case of group of countries. So these are some of the groups of countries that have significant share in global exports, and this is merchandise trade. The issue in terms of statistics, you would find that in the trade environment, much of the statistics are either good statistics or they generally emanate from commercial services, which essentially addresses cross-border trade. So there's a whole body of work to be done in the context of trade and services, because trade and services has different dimensions. Cross-border is only one. There are movement of persons, commercial presence like setting up and doing business in a country in terms of services, or even sending consumers abroad to consume, like for instance in the case of tourism and insurance and repairs, etc. These are some of the other groupings that would fall below the 1% threshold, and the abbreviations and the terms are, I know they might be a bit challenging for some of us if you aren't too familiar with the trading system. But the presentation will be made available and you can always follow it, or if you want to ask questions after, we can talk about it. We also have some figures here in terms of, I have put it in a tabular form, so those with the 1% is on one side and those below the 1% on the other side. Significant groupings in terms of the WTO. Traditionally, there have been two major groupings, the developed countries and the developing countries. And if you go back to the Uruguay round, you would see that the developing countries have been essentially separated into the developing countries proper and the LDCs, which are the lesser developed countries. The WTO membership is just over 150 countries, and of course that's not all the countries in the world, so other countries outside there also trade. Significant factor in the context of world trade goes back to, well, it goes way back, but essentially we are using the Uruguay round as a benchmark. And with the shift from import substitution to trade liberalization back in the 80s or so, we see an emphasis on the lowering of MFN tariffs, which is your highest tariff, excluding the boundary, the tariff available to the rest of the world, and also removing obstacles in the case of services. So you have all kinds of regulatory concerns, and if you want to encourage access to services sectors, you have to generally remove the regulations around the world. And also, the various changes, I think Dr. Hilaire spoke about some changes in the economy, and he spoke about the ups and the downs and the booms and those sort of things. So those things have also impacted on what countries do in the context of world trade. And from time to time, it varies. Arising from the emphasis in world trade and the difficulties in advancing various arrangements, what we have had is a splurge and surge of regional trade agreements. So countries have gone about and forgetting the whole arrangement or complementing the whole arrangement, have gone and engaged in trade agreements either in groups or in one-on-one arrangements or group-to-country arrangements. And currently there are some 371 trade agreements notified, 193 of which are actually in force. And may I say that there are a number of trade agreements that have not been notified to the WTO. These are different types of arrangements: customs union, economic integration arrangements, things like the EPA, preferential trade agreements, etc. And arising from this is that for manufacturers or industries, arrangements that you may have had before a trade agreement has happened, you are losing the hold that you had in such markets. So I think one of the presenters today, or a couple of them, spoke about commodities losing ground like bananas and sugar and those sort of issues. But it happens because countries take unilateral action, or because in the multilateral process concessions are made, or even in bilateral and regional arrangements, external parties end up on the disadvantaged end. Of course, what is really happening in the trade environment as a result of this is you have what we refer to as a spaghetti bowl effect. You have agreements which, if you were to line them up all over, you will have a tremendous task in finding total coherence throughout. For instance, there is something called the rules of origin. If you were to try to coordinate those rules, it would be very difficult. So the point I move to, and I know my time is running out, is that we have the country, the BRICS, the China, the Brazil, the Russia, etc., which are emerging, and the CIVETs, and China is set to overtake the leading exporter in 2010 and thereafter. Pictorially, we have identified the rise of China, and as you see, the trend there. Right, this picture shows a negotiating position where, from a power of strength, the Goliaths always win. Countries try to make use of the development dimension by benefiting from the trade rules. So I will just touch on the trade rules and the Trinidad and Tobago's perspective. So the WTO system essentially, at this moment, the Doha development round is at a standstill, but that does not mean that it is non-functional. There are a number of things that continue, like the trade policy reviews, the notifications, 29 countries waiting to accede. And in addition to that, we might want to consider that in the process, every country is looking at its own interests. For instance, America is dealing with its Buy America campaign. Then there is the trade policy reviews taking place. You have the China currency, which is to be discussed in Washington tomorrow with the G7. You have domestic subsidies and NAMA issues being critical. In terms of Trinidad and Tobago is located within a number of trading arrangements. So it's part of the single market arrangement. Its wider arrangement is with bilaterals, and at the hemispheric and multilateral level, that's the peak. What should be Trinidad and Tobago's response? Well, essentially it's to improve the infrastructural environment so that we seek to put forward certain instruments, like, for instance, the trading system. We would like to put in place by the end of 2010 a single electronic window for businesses. We would seek to take action to improve the global competitiveness index and strengthen our Exim Bank and research facilities. In addition to our infrastructure abroad in foreign territories like China, Brazil, etc. There are also policy measures that we are developing to aid in this process. And since my time is running out, I would like to point to 4 key actions that we plan to take. We plan to review existing agreements, look at expanding trade with other arrangements, developing our trade infrastructure, and building capacity in the local trade sector, which points for a partnership really with the academic institutions like the university in terms of trade research, in terms of studies, data, etc.